People, what is a little bombshell your therapist dropped in one of your sessions that completely changed your outlook? I've never really had close friends. I've had colleagues, classmates, housemates, people I spent time with, but I never truly felt connected to any of them. At one point, I did that thing you see people talk about online. I stopped reaching out to see if anyone would reach out to me. No one did, and I took that as confirmation that they didn't really want me around, or at the very least, that my absence didn't matter. I was talking to my therapist about people I'd been close to in college, and she asked me to pick one and talk about him. So I did. I shared his name, his major, and a few anecdotes. Then she asked, "What else do you know about him?" And I couldn't answer. It wasn't some grand revelation, but when she said, "What else?" I started crying, because for as simple as the question was, my inability to answer spoke volumes. I've never had good friends because I've never been a good friend. I'm withdrawn, reserved. I always let others do the work of pulling me in without ever extending my own effort in return. If I wanted meaningful relationships, I had to build them. I'm still working on this, but I'm trying. I'm making an effort to reach out more, to show more warmth and openness in my daily life. Edit. A few people have asked what specifically I've changed, and I have two answers. First, I've started putting myself in places where I can meet people with shared interests. If you look at my profile, it's pretty obvious I love One Piece and manga in general. While I'm here in Japan, I booked a public tour to visit the statues of the One Piece characters in Kumamoto, the artist's home prefecture. The group ended up being 6 people, and we all bonded over our shared love of the series. At the end of the tour, a couple invited me to join them for dinner. It was the first time I felt like someone genuinely wanted to spend more time with me. I was elated. We talked for 3 hours about theories, favorite moments, the real-world impact of the series, everything. Second, I'm working on asking more questions. I have a habit of talking endlessly when I get onto a topic I'm passionate about. Now, when I catch myself doing that, I try to naturally pause and invite the other person into the conversation, ask for their thoughts, or shift to something more personal. I want to truly know people beyond their favorite quote or arc from a series. And honestly, I'm really glad I started. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. You are not special. At the time, my anxiety was overwhelming, especially around other people. I felt constantly judged, like every stranger was scrutinizing my every move. I couldn't go to the store, take the bus, or even go for a walk without feeling like people were silently criticizing how I dressed, how my hair looked, how I talked, even how I walked. It was terrifying. I told her how I'd started avoiding going out altogether, which was a problem because I had to start college soon. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Name, I'm telling you this with all the care in the world, but you are not special. There is nothing about you that would make me think twice if we passed each other on the street." It was blunt. It was exactly what I needed to hear. My anxiety had convinced me I was the center of everyone's attention, but in reality, people weren't thinking about me at all. Of course, she helped me in other ways too, but that one sentence changed everything. It gave me the push I needed to step outside, to go to college, to just exist without fear. Story 3. Is it your anxiety or hers? Background. I have a very overbearing mother who feels the need to know everything about what I'm doing on my own time in order to sleep at night, according to her. She treats me like a rebellious teenager from a 90s movie, even though I'm a grown woman, pushing 30. At the time my therapist said this, I was around 28, stressing out about an upcoming business trip. It wasn't the trip itself that had me panicking. It was how my mom would react to me leaving the state for a few days. As I ran through the list of texts I knew she'd bombard me with, my therapist dropped this bombshell. She gave me permission to stop managing my mom's fears the way I had for years. End result. I went on the trip without telling her a thing, and since then, I've set a few more sanity-saving boundaries. Story 4. I was addicted to misery. I was unknowingly causing much of my own anxiety and depression. People don't often talk about how comforting the darkness can feel for those of us who've struggled with mental illness. At some point, feeling happy or good becomes unfamiliar and even anxiety-inducing. I would be triggered by something that should have only been mildly upsetting, and I'd listen to sad music, watch a sad movie, or read a sad book. I'd start thinking about all the times I'd been hurt or abandoned. I thought everyone went to bed at night with their chest tight and their stomach in knots, guilt-ridden over everything they'd ever done wrong. I'd do whatever I could to make it worse without even realizing it. Once my therapist pointed this out, my life did a complete 180. I was on 4 different medications to manage anxiety, depression, and sleep, and now, 3 years later, I'm completely medication-free. I learned to identify the patterns, call them out, and replace them with healthier coping mechanisms. I started feeling more in control, more aware, and more confident. I became more accountable for my actions. Everyday life just became easier than I ever thought it could be. If that's where you are now, fight it. It's worth it. Story 5. Let them. This isn't something my therapist told me, but it's a concept Mel Robbins talks about, and it truly changed my life. People gossiping about you? Let them. Your boyfriend wants to break up? Let him. Your friend doesn't take your advice that you think is best? Let them. People don't agree with you? Let them. For a long time, I struggled with being the fixer friend, the one who gives and wants everyone to like her. It stemmed from a need to control certain aspects of my life. I've been actively working on this for the past 4 years, and this let them theory made all the difference. I don't need to control how people see me, their life choices, or their opinions that don't match mine. I don't need to hold on to relationships that aren't mutual or shouldn't even be in my life. It's been a game changer for my mindset. I've already noticed a significant decrease in stress and anxiety. I'm still working on it, and I still slip up sometimes, but when I do, I remind myself, let them. And I move on to what's in front of me. Story 6. I was telling my therapist how I never wanted to ask for help. Not from anyone really, but especially not from the people I respect the most, like my parents. As an adult, I wanted them to see me as independent and strong, as if they'd done such a great job raising me that I didn't need them anymore. I wanted them to feel proud of how resourceful, tough, and smart I was in handling things on my own. That's why I couldn't bring myself to ask for their help. Then my therapist paused for a moment and said, I understand that, but imagine how you would feel if your son said he didn't feel like he could come to you for help. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm not the type to cry easily, but the tears came, and I couldn't stop for probably 10 minutes. The idea that my son wouldn't see me as the first person to turn to for help, someone he could always count on, was unbearable. It was a wake-up call, and after working through it, I learned to swallow my pride, ask for help when I need it, and accept support from the people I care about. They wouldn't think any less of me. In fact, they'd probably be happy to help. Story 7. Live with grace, and you can grieve someone who is still alive. I've always felt like I've had the worst luck. Take prom night, for example. My dress ripped, a swan attacked me at the winery where we were taking pictures. I never got the food I ordered at the restaurant, and my boyfriend's truck broke down in the middle of nowhere. My life has often felt like a series of unfortunate events, and I would constantly beat myself up, trying desperately to control anything I could to prevent more bad luck from happening. Then, in March of 2021, I went through a traumatic labor and delivery that left my daughter with global brain damage. I was told she would be severely delayed. I struggled with intense anger and guilt, wishing I could change the outcome and fix her. Seeking help, I went to a therapist and explained how my life always seemed out of control and how the lack of control over my daughter's situation made me furious. Her first piece of advice was simple yet profound. You need to live with grace. At first, it sounded almost silly to me. What does grace even mean? She explained that grace meant accepting things as they are, without dwelling on the past or what could have been. Focusing on changing the outcome or fixing things quickly would get me nowhere. She continued, you can grieve someone who is still alive. You thought she would be this or that, but she might not be. It's okay to be upset by that. But look at the new world of opportunities and accomplishments you'll get to experience instead. That hit me hard. I realized it was okay to grieve the life I thought I would have, but I needed to embrace the life I actually had. Now, almost 3 years later, my daughter is still delayed, but has made incredible progress. She walks, sits up on her own, brushes her own teeth, and is learning to communicate. These were things I once thought she'd never do. Both my therapist and my daughter have taught me invaluable lessons. I allowed myself to grieve, but most importantly, I've fallen deeply in love with the amazing little girl she is today. I love being her mom and wouldn't change a thing. Sometimes you just need to feel your emotions, accept things as they are, and keep moving forward. Story 8. It may sound simple, but when someone told me, your safe space is feeling unsafe, It really helped me understand why I would often say I was fine when I knew I absolutely wasn't. It explained why I was okay with financially and emotionally supporting my abusers, and why I never seemed to prioritize getting away from them. When you're first learning how to set healthy boundaries, it's easy to overlook how compromised they actually are. It also helped me understand why I thrived in such an unhealthy work environment and felt completely out of place in my new, much healthier one. It was also why I always felt inferior or secretly hated by the genuinely healthy people I started surrounding myself with. I was just feeling unsafe, even though all the visible and behavioral signs showed that my new relationships were healthy. Unlearning this warped way of thinking has been difficult. I spent most of my life constantly strategizing every move I made and word I spoke, which I thought was normal. Even now, in a much better place in so many ways, I'm still caught off guard by real safety. It's getting better day by day, and I'm okay with that. But I'll always remember how profound that simple statement was. Story 9. I had a huge fallout with my father. He was a toxic presence in my life and caused a lot of harm to my brothers and me. After I went no contact with him, my family started putting a lot of pressure on me to reach out to him again, and I felt guilty about it. I knew he came from a broken childhood. I understood his life story and the reasons behind his behavior. I also knew that his actions stemmed from his own pain, and that he didn't know how to be a parent any differently. I had tried to get him to go to therapy or even acknowledge the issues, but he always refused. My therapist said, "Imagine you go to an animal shelter and see a dog that's been seized by animal control. It's a vicious, snarling dog that bites and attacks. You can look at that dog and understand that it's not its fault. It's been abused, trained to act this way, and it never had a chance. You can feel compassion for the dog, but do you think it's a good idea to get into the kennel with an aggressive, biting dog?" It was like a light bulb went off in my head. Story 10. There is a difference between being kind and being a doormat. I was raised to walk on eggshells with people, but I'm stubborn, willful, and outspoken, so I'd never considered being a doormat. It blew me away and really helped me advocate for myself when people inevitably took my kindness as an invitation to leech. Edit. Also, that when you talk to yourself, most people praise in first person but berate themselves in second person. I am really proud of myself versus, "Oh you dumbass, insert your name." We are talking down to ourselves as if someone else were speaking to us, but we stand alone to praise ourselves. It seems so sad to me and has definitely made me think twice about why I talk to myself in second person in a way that I would never speak to another human. Story 11. I was struggling with alcoholism, and we were talking about how I'd been cutting back. She asked me what I would consider success when it came to my drinking. I told her I wanted to reach a point where it no longer interfered with my daily life, where I could simply have a glass of wine at holiday dinners or family gatherings. She paused for a moment, then asked, "Why? Why was it so important for me to drink on those occasions?" It was like a switch flipped. Alcohol had always been a centerpiece of every family event for as long as I could remember. The smell of bourbon reminded me of my uncle. Vermouth reminded me of my dad. Alcohol was woven into almost every happy childhood memory. But beyond that, I was terrified of the explanation I'd have to give if I stopped drinking. What would I say when family and friends asked why I wasn't having a drink? I had tried to quit before and failed. What if I admitted I had a problem, only to relapse? Her question made me see the bigger picture for the first time. I was willing to drink myself to death just to avoid scrutiny, to escape the judgment that might come if I failed again. That was the day I quit. I've been sober since May 6, 2017. 2,407 days. Story 12. I was married, gay, and struggling with deep religious conflicts. One day, my partner listened to all my inner turmoil and said, "Well, as I see it, you have three options. 1, you can stop being gay. There's no proof anyone has ever done that, but maybe you'll be the first. 2, you can keep living a double life. It's tearing you apart, but it's your choice. 3, you can accept that you're gay and handle it like a responsible adult." When he laid it out like that, the path forward became clear. 35 years later, I'm incredibly happy, married to a wonderful man, and my former wife is now a close friend. Story 13. When I was 21, I was furious with my alcoholic father, still in denial about his issues. During a therapy session, I spent nearly the entire 50 minutes listing all the reasons I hated and despised him. Then my therapist said something that shocked me. I think you're actually more angry with your mother than your father." I was immediately offended. How could I possibly be angry with my innocent mother, who had endured my dad's drunken rages, his unavailability, his violence, his abuse? I left that session more enraged than when I walked in, and I never returned to that therapist. I couldn't believe she'd said something so wrong. I was in utter disbelief that a therapist could misunderstand me so badly. But then, not long after that ridiculous suggestion, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Oh my God, I don't like my mother. She was the one who stayed with my abusive father. She was the one who let me witness the abuse and told me to protect her. She was the one crying on my little 5, 6, 7-year-old shoulder when he hadn't come home again. She was the one who ignored my desperate pleas for her to leave him. She was supposed to be my protector, my guardian, but instead, she was the one constantly berating my dad, criticizing him for everything, good or bad. She was the one pulling away her love from him, creating distance in their relationship. She was the one who got visibly jealous when my dad and I bonded or talked. She was the covert, vulnerable narcissist. Story 14. "Why do you think you're lazy?" she asked. Then she started listing everything she knew I was doing, for my family, my job, and my life. It caught me off guard when I struggled to come up with a single example to prove her wrong. She also described family dysfunction like water. Some families have waves so big that everyone can see them crashing on the surface. Others are better at hiding it, but beneath the calm exterior, there's still a powerful riptide pulling everything under. It made me realize that keeping the surface still doesn't change what's happening underneath. Story 15. I told her I thought I was just a weak person. She walked over to the whiteboard, drew a timeline of the past year, and asked me to list the major events that had happened. As I spoke, we mapped them out, 7 unrelated traumatic events, all packed into a single year, 2019. I just stared at it, speechless. Then she said, "Most people experience only 1 to 3 traumatic events of this magnitude in their entire lifetime." And I cried. But I didn't look at it and think, wow, life has been so unfair to me. I looked at it and thought, I'm still here. Life kept throwing horrors at me, yet I was sitting in that room, still fighting. I still have moments where I doubt my strength, but when I think back to that day, I remember, I am made of steel. Story 16. For context, when I was 28, I went through a major TBI, seizures, strokes, just an all-around terrible time for my brain. You have to grieve the loss of yourself. Most people just wanted me to go back to who I was before. But the harsh reality is that part of my brain is gone. The person everyone knew, including me, died that day. I had to grieve the loss of myself. Story 17. I kept talking about how I felt like a completely different person after my mom passed away. Like there was a clear divide between who I was before and after her death. But one day, she asked about my hobbies. As I started describing everything I loved to do, or at least used to before falling into a deep depression, I got really into it. She smiled and said, "Wow, you seem really passionate." And I just sat there realizing, yeah, I guess I am. I may be grieving, but I can't change what I love. Those things are still a part of me. It was like she knew exactly when to step back and let me see it for myself. I don't know, maybe it only makes sense to me, but that moment really helped me start finding my way back. Story 18. I had to learn this one for myself over years of internalizing everything and hating myself. I wasn't allowed to angry or upset. I was yelled at if I stood up to my big brother's bullying. I was made to believe I had to be strong and independent, yet was punished for being too independent. It was like I couldn't win, and that led to self-hatred. As I got older and lived alone, I learned I could stand up for myself and how to actually do that. At first it was so hard and I felt bad for it, but when I reflected on why is it I feel bad, I defended myself in that situation. I grew to love myself more, not beat myself up for everything, and become much happier. Story 19. My counselor said to imagine myself as an orange. Then, consider that not all people like oranges. That doesn't mean that the orange is flawed in any way, not rotten, just that everyone has preferences. That helped ease my insecurities and need for people-pleasing dramatically. Story 20. I used to say a lot of things I wanted to do and then follow up with, but it's hard. My therapist asked me one time how it would feel to say what I wanted to do and then say, and it's hard. I can't believe I hadn't considered that myself in 4 decades, but man, did it change my mindset on certain things. Story 21. It seems like you have some kind of block in your brain, or something to that effect. I constantly struggled with motivation and accomplishing things, and regularly felt like I was paralyzed or stuck because my brain wasn't listening to me. It was amazing hearing someone put what I had been feeling into words, and acknowledging that there was an issue beyond me needing to try harder. Of course, I later found out that the block was in fact a symptom of ADHD, and it almost completely disappeared when I started ADHD meds a few years later. Story 22. Wow. I was talking about my mother's behavior through my life and my upbringing in general. I often use it as a joke that I made my therapist say this. However, she followed it up by telling me that considering all that had happened and the stuff I had been through, I was doing really well in life. I shouldn't be so hard on myself and needed to focus more on my positive achievements rather than letting my remaining flaws hold my focus. It's a moment I keep coming back to. It was also very cathartic to have a professional pretty much agree that my past life was nuts. Story 23. I'm not a therapist. I'm an ESL, English as a Second Language, teacher in Japan. However, since my classes are one-on-one, I spend a lot of time having personal conversations and offering consultations. One thing I said to a client once seemed to really change his perspective. A lot of my students are learning English for international business, and this particular client, like many of them, was really worried about making mistakes and looking foolish. I asked him if the English-speaking colleagues he works with ever try speaking Japanese, and he said they do. I asked if they ever make mistakes, and he admitted that they do. I then asked him to name one of their mistakes, and he couldn't. That's when I told him, your mistakes will be forgotten too. Story 24. It wasn't my therapist, it was my girlfriend's dad, who happens to be a therapist, and we were chatting over a pint. I was venting about my father, how he was narcissistic, always right, mentally abusive to my mother, financially controlling, and absent in so many ways, though I'll give him credit for working hard. I was frustrated, saying I didn't want a relationship with him and felt like I learned nothing from him except that, if I ever had kids, I'd do the exact opposite of what he did. Then he turned to me and said, so basically, he taught you how to be a good father. That one shift in perspective stopped me dead in my tracks. It was enough to help me let go of the neglect and grief I had carried over never having the father I wanted. Story 25. This might not be a groundbreaking revelation, but it's something I've realized after seeing several different therapists over the years and still not feeling much progress. Therapists operate from different therapeutic beliefs and practices, but this isn't often discussed. While it seems like a basic point, it really impacts the effectiveness of therapy. If you seek out a therapist for a specific trauma, the approach can vary significantly depending on whether they're trained in psychotherapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The point is, you wouldn't see a dermatologist to treat a broken bone, even though both are medical professionals. Similarly, the type of therapist you see matters, depending on your issue. Many therapists use an eclectic approach, but it's important to consider whether the therapy you're receiving is effective for your specific problem, especially if you feel stuck in your progress. Story 26. During my treatment for PTSD, when I was in a really dark place, my therapist asked me to imagine being in a park on a rainy day. As you walk through the park, you hear a baby crying. You follow the sound and find a baby alone on a bench. He asked me what I would do, and I immediately said I'd make sure the baby was okay, call the police, try to find the parents, and comfort the baby. Then he asked, what if that baby was you? I knew I wasn't in a good place, but hearing that question made me realize just how much I hated myself. It revealed how deeply negative my self-image was, so much so that I wouldn't have wanted to help that baby if it was me. That session stayed with me for a long time. It's taken a lot of work, but I've slowly learned to love myself. I still have tough days, but I'm taking it one day at a time. Story 27. As I was wrapping up a session and putting my coat on to leave, my therapist asked, why do you always fall for unavailable women? Without hesitation, I responded, I don't feel like I actually deserve anyone, so by falling for unavailable women, I get to tell myself I tried, even though I know I'm setting myself up to fail. I'm not sure who was more shocked by my answer, her or me. Fast forward a few years, and I'm now 2 years into my first healthy relationship, hers too, and engaged. I've come to realize that my issue wasn't about my worth to others, but how I felt about myself. Interestingly, at the start of our relationship, my future wife also felt like she didn't deserve me, and we spent the first 6 months working through that. It was part of the journey of growing up as lesbians in a small town and being rejected by most people around us. Story 28. He was a good dad, but a bad husband, and he wasn't your husband. It wasn't your job to fix that marriage. My parents hated each other, eventually broke up. I was always closer to my dad, but spent most of my childhood with my mom due to financial struggles. I love both of them, so I was always caught in the middle. Growing up, I constantly heard about how awful he was, but to me, he was always open, loving, and non-judgmental when I struggled with things. When my counselor said this, it shifted my whole perspective. It wasn't, and never would be, my responsibility to fix their messed-up marriage. He was a good dad, and that's what mattered most. Story 29. You were just a child. You did the best you could. You had to carry burdens that most adults would struggle with. Many things were out of your control. You weren't selfish for choosing to protect yourself. For context, I grew up in an incredibly abusive household. I ended up raising some of my younger siblings and worked odd jobs under the table before I was legally old enough to work, just to make sure we had food. There were times I'd be left alone for weeks while the adults in my life went on benders. Those were, strangely, the most peaceful times, something I looked forward to, minus the aftermath. I did everything I could to shield my siblings from the full extent of the abuse and neglect. I redirected the physical and verbal abuse onto myself to protect them. I never let them see how overwhelmed I was trying to keep us safe. There were times I couldn't afford to feed all of us, so I'd tell them I wasn't hungry. When they went to bed, I'd break down in private, overwhelmed by exhaustion and stress. I tried to give them as normal a childhood as I could, taking on extra work so they could go on school trips, taking them to the park, treating them when I could. I wanted to show them unconditional love, even when I felt like it was never enough. I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't know how to cope with my own trauma at the time. Sometimes I'd get so angry, I'd scream at them over the smallest things. I never hit them, but I came close. I felt guilty all the time for losing my temper. Eventually, I made the decision to run away. At the time, I told myself I had to leave or I would end up dead. And then who would protect my siblings? I haven't seen them since. A week later, after years of evidence of the abuse, CPS stepped in. I struggled with the separation, constantly questioning if I left for the right reasons, or if I just wanted to save myself. I felt so much guilt and shame for not protecting them fully, for my anger, for not doing more. That was when my therapist said those words to me. Story 30. After a 3-year battle with Alzheimer's, with a strange meth addict moving into my mom's garage to help her and my disabled sister, while I was constantly in and out of hospitals with my 4-year-old daughter undergoing multiple brain surgeries, burying my mom, handling her estate, then having to move my 3 kids and 2 cats to another city, sell my old house, and buy a new one, I thought, Jesus Christ, will this absolute madness ever end? I was drowning in stress, my brain was fried from the trauma, I was devastated by how my mom was treated by my sister and the meth addict, and I was barely holding on to my sanity. I sat with my therapist, telling her all about the chaotic mess I had to navigate while still trying to be there for my daughter. I mentioned how I lived 50 miles away from my mom, but made sure to visit weekly to check on her. I said, I'm so full of bitterness I can't even leave my house. I feel stuck in this place. It's been a whole year in my new town, in my new house, but I'm still stuck in the past. She told me, bitterness is sadness plus anger. If you break those down, it becomes easier to forgive yourself for everything you're angry about and allow yourself to grieve. That advice helped me more than I can say, along with the EMDR therapy I started. Story 31. During a conversation with my therapist, we discussed my uncle, who is one of the most kind, generous, and caring people I know. I admire him deeply. He's an incredibly dedicated doctor and scientist, yet he constantly criticizes himself, feeling like he's never good enough. His therapist once asked him to describe himself, and then people he admired. As he described others, the therapist held up a mirror, urging him to describe himself instead. This moment triggered a profound shift in him, and when I heard this story, it sparked a change in me too. Later, as we discussed my own struggles with self-doubt, insecurity, and depression, my therapist asked me, quite directly, A, how my uncle would describe me, and B, how he would feel to hear me speak so negatively about myself. Sometimes, it's hard to see the forest for the trees. Story 32. This wasn't directly my therapist, but here's the story. I was in the process of getting evaluated for bariatric surgery, which included a mental health evaluation. My surgeon recommended a psychiatrist who specialized in eating disorders and these kinds of evaluations, and who was in-network for my insurance. I made an appointment, and they sent me a thick packet of paperwork, clearly stating it was required to complete everything in full and bring it with me to the appointment. No big deal, right? It was mostly disclosures and boilerplate stuff, just sign and date everything. But then came the tough part, a 12-page questionnaire about me and my life. They made it clear that if anything wasn't completed, they'd cancel the appointment, possibly reschedule it, and charge a cancellation fee. Fortunately, I had enough time to work through it, but the questions were pretty tough. On the day of the appointment, I double-checked everything. They even provided a helpful checklist to make sure I didn't miss anything, so I felt pretty prepared. I arrived at the office, a small but nice space in the hospital's medical wing. The receptionist greeted me by name, had me sign in, and went over the paperwork, checking for completeness. She handed me back my questionnaire and told me it would be a minute. When they called me back, the doctor greeted me and asked for my questionnaire. He explained the structure of the meeting, then sat down and began reading through my answers. I had to clarify a couple of things because my handwriting wasn't perfect, but everything seemed normal until he set the paperwork aside, looked me directly in the eye, and casually said, "Well, mister, your family didn't want you around very much as a kid, did they?" The shock hit me like a ton of bricks, but after a moment, I swallowed, thought about it, and agreed. That moment changed a lot for me. I went on to have the surgery and lost 120 pounds, and I can honestly say it was worth it in every way. Story 33. It was my first session with the lady therapist. Almost in the middle or towards the end of the session, she dropped this: "Your source of happiness is always external." I gave her a what the F look, thinking in my head what other ways one can be happy. That was back when my internal systems were in a mess. I thought about what she said a lot while going back home. I was so irritated that I couldn't find an answer to that dilemma. I canceled going to her for further sessions. I got what she meant many years later, living in a different city, when I started experiencing joy within myself and feeling joyous for no reason. I remembered her and thanked her in my mind for giving me that jolt back then. Story 34. When my therapist pointed out that I often used the word but to describe people who were causing me problems, like saying, "He's a clever guy, but he doesn't know what he's talking about," she suggested I replace but with "and." That simple change completely shifted how I viewed others and how I judged them. Instead of seeing people in black and white terms, the word, and helped me find balance between the positive and negative aspects of their behavior. For example, "He's a clever guy and he doesn't know what he's talking about," allowed me to accept both qualities as true without judgment. Once I applied this to my perspective on others, I realized I could do the same for myself. Instead of critiquing myself with a "but," I could accept both the good and the bad with an "and." It helped reduce the judgments that fueled my anxiety and depression. Story 35. There were two from separate therapists. The first one: "You have situational depression, because I think your mother has pretty severe codependency towards you." Light bulb. Wait, I don't need to take medication, I just need to not live with my mom. Done. The second therapist a few years later: "Yeah, I think you're healthy, it's just your stepmother is making you the scapegoat of your family, and do you know the term gaslighting?" So basically, two separate therapists years apart told me I was normal and mentally healthy, just stressed due to having to deal with crazy people all the time. And now it's over a decade later, and I've had my own life separate from any family for a long time, and I'm consistently a stable, happy human on my own. Imagine that. Story 36. Earlier this year, I was talking to my therapist, who ended up moving, and said, "I think I'd rather be alone for the rest of my life. It's so exhausting trying to be with someone, and I'm happy with my own company." I made that comment while he was turning to check dates and times for my next appointment. When he turned back around, he asked, in the most sincere and kind way, "Do you really think that?" I almost started crying right there. I just said, "Yeah, I think so," but inside I felt awful. Of course, I don't want to be alone, and he knew that. Eventually, I opened up, admitting that I do want a happy, healthy relationship and to share something meaningful with another person. That moment almost brought him to tears too. Therapy has been both incredibly helpful and tough. Especially this past week, with my new therapist being more direct. It's definitely been helpful for me in its own way. Story 37. I worked in mental health emergency services for nearly a decade, and one day I just broke. I couldn't do it anymore. I could barely function. I ran off to visit some friends in another province, trying to get away. While I was there, I met someone who was a friend of a friend. We were talking, and she went on about how important compassion is in the world. Somewhat bitterly, I said, "Look, I just spent 10 years practicing compassion. If compassion were a lymph node, it's just a burnt-out husk now." She paused and said, "Did you think to include yourself in that?" It completely blew my mind. It's still hard to do, but it really, really helped. Story 38. This might be a bit long-winded, but my wife and I went through a rough start in our marriage, and I was getting frustrated. I decided to start therapy. About 3 months in, I was venting about how my wife reacts to confrontations or tough discussions. We come from very different backgrounds. I grew up in a large, well-off family on a big horse farm. I was a star athlete, popular, and everything seemed easy. She, on the other hand, was an only child of a recovering alcoholic single mother who never knew her father. She grew up on welfare in a wealthy town and struggled socially. Knowing all of this, my therapist said something that completely changed my perspective. "You grew up on a horse farm with big dogs, right?" "Yep. In general, what's the difference in how you approach a horse versus how you approach a dog? With horses, you have to move slowly and gently. Be purposeful. They're big and strong but naturally prey animals, so they don't always know that you mean no harm. Even if they do know you, you still need to approach slowly and calmly. Dogs, on the other hand, are usually more confident, so you can approach them more confidently and casually." Great. Now you're the dog. Your wife is the horse. Remember that with every interaction you have with her, every compliment, every difficult conversation. That one session saved my marriage. Now, 15 years later, things just keep getting better. Story 39. I finally admitted the thing that had haunted me my entire life. "I'm fat." Her response was simple. "So what?" I was stunned. "What do you mean, so what?" This has been my greatest struggle, the battle I've fought for years, the thing that filled my mind with self-hatred. She asked again, "So you're fat. So what? What does that mean?" I paused, letting the feelings shift into words. "It means I'm unworthy of love." She nodded and let me sit with my own statement. Saying it out loud helped me realize how false that belief was. I have a wonderful husband who loves and adores me just as I am. I just never believed I deserved it. But now I do. And whenever those negative thoughts about my body creep back in, I remind myself, so what? Story 40. I was actually thinking about this today. It's not really a one-liner, but more of a story my therapist shared about his brother. His brother was an alcoholic with anger issues and a long history of domestic violence. He smoked a pack a day and would brush people off with a "screw you" if they even said hello to him on the street. One day, this brother saw a building on fire. It was an old house turned into apartments. The firemen were working to control the flames before going inside. A neighbor was screaming, thinking people were still inside. So this violent, troubled man rushes into the burning building. He pulled out 2 kids and a woman, suffering third-degree burns in the process. He was hospitalized for almost a year and never once brought up what he'd done. He never sought recognition or an award, and his family only found out when they pieced things together from the news and noticed his timely hospitalization. That's when I realized that people aren't one-dimensional. No matter how messed up someone may seem, they can still choose to do good. And I realized that I too wasn't one-dimensional, and I had the power to choose to do good. Story 41. Oh, my therapist loved these moments. She was so no-nonsense and broke everything down into such simple, direct points that it often left me stunned. 2 of my favorite moments were these. Early on in therapy, when I was ready to dump all my past trauma so we could work through it, she said, "We don't need to deal with that yet, or necessarily at all. More importantly, how it's affecting you now. That's what we'll focus on first." The how it's affecting me now meant panic attacks, dysfunction, etc. That stopped me cold. It was the first time I encountered a therapist who was truly competent, and it had never occurred to me that I didn't need to revisit everything from my childhood in order to function in the present. Then, there was the time I brought up the gaps in certain memories I knew I had, and she responded with, "Your brain blocked those for a reason. They might come back for some people, but you don't need them back. Letting them stay gone is healthier. You already know what happened. There's no need to add more trauma to what you've already been through." These aren't exact quotes, just how I remember the conversation, but they really changed the way I saw things. Story 42. Out of nowhere, I was told that I might have a brain tumor or be developing schizophrenia. I was around 19, I think. People expected me to easily breeze through my degrees, but instead I completely crashed. No one knew why. That set off a long period of trying to figure out what was wrong with me mentally. This was after I'd been telling my parents and healthcare professionals for years that something was wrong, and I needed help. For years, the response I got from both my mental health providers and my parents was always some variation of, "You're lazy. You're arrogant. You don't want to structure your life enough. Play less video games." My healthcare providers kindly told my parents to be tougher on me, as if that was the solution. One of the main culprits in all of this is the only person in my life I truly deeply hate to this day, for refusing to listen to his client or put in any effort. Then, somehow, the story made its way to one of my psychiatrists from my teenage years who had treated both me and my brother for ADHD-related issues. He contacted us. At that point, I was at rock bottom mentally, discovering new layers of suffering every day, and I got sent to an observation stay for 3 weeks so they could either confirm or rule out schizophrenia. The thought of having either that or cancer certainly wasn't doing any wonders for my mental health. So, 3 weeks in a clinic followed, surrounded by other people who were clearly struggling too. The atmosphere was bleak and depressing. The buildings felt like temporary containers that somehow became permanent. Dinner was delivered around 2 p.m., left in a hallway to be reheated at dinner time, and smelled absolutely disgusting. I know, but I'm trying to paint a picture of how people with mental health issues are treated. I had some major breakdowns at night, genuinely feeling like I was losing my mind. I went to the night shift staff for urgent help. I was given an Advil and told to go back to my room. Story 43. Growing up, I endured severe abuse at the hands of my older brother. Recently, a situation unfolded where he was living on the family farm. Though it's a really nice house, my brother completely destroyed it. He was deep in psychosis and forced his son to tear down the walls of my grandmother's house at gunpoint, searching for money and drugs. I suspect he was on meth, though my family got upset when I came to that conclusion. My family then pressured me to help pay for my brother to go to a private facility. My husband and I are financially comfortable, but it's because of his hard work. I don't feel it's my money to spend. Plus, my husband despises my brother because of what he did to me, so there's no way I would spend that kind of money on him, especially when my parents have already given him hundreds of thousands of dollars. My family kept pressing me to explain what he had done, but when I tried, I physically couldn't speak. I was so terrified to tell them what happened. The moment I was able to, I went to therapy. My therapist said, "You don't owe your family an explanation. You don't owe anyone an explanation." I've never cried so hard in my life. My face stayed swollen for days. Story 44. I've been through some tough stuff in my life. I grew up with what was probably mild autism and ADHD, which made it hard to fit in with other kids. My family tried, but they didn't really know how to help. I ended up finding a great best friend and made it to adulthood, which is still challenging, but I'm here, damn it. I told my therapist about how I got through things, how I coped, and while things weren't perfect, most of my childhood didn't bother me that much anymore. Then I shared the story about the time my next-door neighbor pushed me out of his treehouse, and I ended up spraining my wrist badly. I think it may have been a minor break, but it was treated at home as a sprain. My therapist nodded and said she had always wondered why, whenever I talked about something that didn't bother me, I would always cradle my right wrist, almost like I was shielding it. She explained that protecting the site of an old injury is a common response in PTSD. Story 45. My psychiatrist had recently started a new routine where she weighed all her patients before our sessions, followed by taking our blood pressure. During one of these weigh-ins, I had gained about 10 pounds since starting college. She made several negative comments about it and seemed genuinely concerned by the sudden fluctuation, which left me feeling awful, even though I was still within a normal BMI range. So, I set myself a goal to lose the 10 pounds before my next appointment, and I managed to do it. When I stepped on the scale for my follow-up, I was nervous, but when I saw that I'd hit my target weight, I felt elated. I even skipped eating beforehand, hoping to impress her. I expected some kind of praise or recognition, but instead, she muttered something about how that was quite a severe fluctuation, gave me a disapproving look, and just moved me along. I felt completely deflated. That was when it hit me, If I was investing so much emotional energy into trying to make my psychiatrist happy, and she was being so judgmental about it all, I was only setting myself up for disappointment. It made me question what kind of mental health professional would make negative comments about their client's weight, especially when they weren't being treated for any eating or body-related issues. I realized only a truly reckless mental health professional would risk giving vulnerable people body image issues. So, I called my GP and asked if they could prescribe my medication directly so I wouldn't have to see her anymore, even if it cost me more money. They agreed, and I never looked back. Most of my memories of her, someone I'd been seeing since I was a child, are filled with feelings of being judged, forgotten, or disapproved of. But the weight comments were the final straw. Good riddance. Story 46. I had very little sense of self-worth. My therapist suggested I tell myself positive things every day, but I immediately rejected the idea and thought it was silly. Over time, she dug deeper into why I was so opposed to it, and I realized that I believed being kind to myself would turn me into a delusional, conceited person. She looked at me and said, "You realize how absurd that is, right? You can barely be 1% kinder to yourself, and you think you're going to suddenly become a completely different person." That was a light bulb moment for me. She was right. I could be kind to myself without becoming someone completely different, and someone I perceived as worse. So, I finally started allowing myself to be a little kinder to me. Story 47. I was expressing my frustration to my therapist about how my mom constantly enables my brother, who's been struggling with addiction for over 6 years. She does this because she feels needed, while I was working full-time, married with 2 young kids, and graduating with my PhD. She would spend so much time, or what she thought was helpful, driving him everywhere, giving him money, and doing countless other things, but rarely gave any thought to me or my other adult siblings. I told my therapist about a time when I asked my mom to babysit for a couple of hours so my husband and I could go out for dinner. It was the first time we'd ever asked her to do this. She wouldn't even consider it because my brother mentioned he might need a ride that evening. He had lost his license due to DUIs. My therapist said, "You know, your mom is never going to choose you over your brother." Hearing that felt like a slap in the face, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. Story 48. This isn't mine, but my wife's therapist once said, "Some people do drugs." My wife was struggling with hobbies and interests because she'd been taught from a young age that anything you're good at or enjoy should be monetized. The idea of do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life was drilled into her, and she also fell victim to the modern hustle mentality. Work harder, try harder, work more, and eventually you'll be happy and get everything you want. On top of that, with her ADHD, she'd constantly jump from hobby to hobby, trying to monetize every passion she had. This led to burnout and guilt, as she thought enjoying something for herself, without turning it into work, was selfish. That's when her therapist looked at her, shrugged, and said, "Some people do drugs." When my wife asked what she meant, the therapist explained that everyone needs hobbies or activities that make them happy, regardless of whether they serve any greater purpose. Not everything needs to have an end goal other than simply bringing joy. She went on to remind her that not everything preached in self-help culture is some kind of rule to live by. It's okay to be human. It's okay to slip up, make mistakes, and just be real with yourself. The goal of life is to be happy. If you're trying to lose weight but really want a piece of pie, eat a slice of pie and get back to your diet tomorrow. Some people do drugs. Do you play video games but feel guilty because you've been told it's a waste of time? Play your games and enjoy yourself. Some people do drugs. Story 49. Just this Thanksgiving, my therapist suddenly passed away at dinner with her family. A sudden pulmonary embolism. Just like that, she was gone. I had met with her only a few days earlier. Strangely, it affected me more than I thought it would, losing someone I didn't have personal ties to or a long-standing friendship with. It made me realize that anything can happen at any time, to anyone. We can just suddenly be gone. It wasn't something we ever discussed in detail. I have enough of my own issues to focus on. But her unexpected passing really made something click in my mind. I haven't even tried to find a new therapist yet. I'm doing well, truly appreciating life, and realizing that most of the problems I face, I end up creating myself. I hate to admit it, but her untimely death may have taught me more than anything else she could have said or done. It's heartbreaking. She was only 44 and left behind 2 young children and a husband. As a side note, I had a different therapist when I lived elsewhere. Her husband suddenly passed away in February without warning. Now I can't help but wonder if I somehow carried death with me to my therapists. Story 50. I tend to believe that everyone I consider a friend is only actually my friend out of pity, that they're just tolerating me to be nice, and that I'm always annoying or irritating them. The therapist in training at my college, who has been the best therapist I've had after trying several others, asked me one day, "Is that logical?" And in that moment, the light bulb finally clicked. No, it's not logical. I don't treat other people that way, though I might occasionally on rare occasions. People don't go out of their way for others they don't see any value in having a relationship with. That realization helped me work through years of self-doubt, and now, that particular thought pattern is almost gone. Story 51. My mom and her sisters grew up with a narcissistic, drug-addicted mother who regularly put them in dangerous situations. When my mom was young, her parents divorced, and she went to live with her dad, which spared her from at least some of the abuse, but her sisters stayed behind. Their mother ended up exploiting the sisters when they became teenagers. My mom's younger sister struggled with addiction, had multiple kids with different men, and was constantly losing custody of her children. She couldn't keep a job or a place to stay, and my grandfather often gave her money to help, but she would waste it on drugs. She was eventually diagnosed with diabetes and lost both of her legs as a result. Despite all of this, she would go on Facebook and rant about how no one ever helped her and how she had to go through everything alone. As a teenager, I couldn't understand why she'd say that, especially when my grandfather was actively trying to help. When I shared this with my therapist, she said something that completely changed how I view and treat others. Because no one did when it mattered. My aunt was forever stuck in the trauma cycle of being a young girl with no one to turn to. No one helped her when she was 13 and being forced to sleep with adult men for money. No one helped her when she needed it most, and that feeling, that trauma response, stayed with her. I think about this whenever I encounter someone with what others might label a victim mentality. You never know what someone has endured before you met them. My aunt has since passed away. Story 52. I was talking to her about how I had this terrible tendency to stay in unhealthy relationships, and I couldn't understand why. Many women are labeled as having daddy issues, but I had the most loving and devoted father who showed me every day what a man of character and integrity looked like, especially in the way he loved my mother and all of us kids. Why do I accept these relationships? Why can't I walk away? Why don't I have the same standards for relationships that my parents had, especially when they constantly told me how much I was worth? That's when my therapist brought up my childhood essay that happened when I was 5 years old, by an older child who was my best friend and someone I looked up to. Remember how you told me that when he first essayed you, you knew it was wrong? And how you couldn't understand how the person who was supposed to love and protect you could hurt you like that? She paused, then continued. That was the moment you began to connect love with pain. It has nothing to do with your dad and everything to do with your 5-year-old self reasoning that if the person who loved me didn't protect me, then love is always going to involve hurt. It felt like a bomb exploded inside me, shattering everything I thought I knew. I don't even have the words to explain how deeply it affected me then, and still does today. Story 53. I had been hesitant about even seeking therapy, afraid to open up to someone who wasn't emotionally invested in me. By my 4th session, I was talking about my childhood and how I felt stronger as I grew past the pain. I don't often think about my drug-addict parents or the damage their lifestyle caused to me and my siblings. When I do, I feel bitter and angry, and I struggle to relate to others who didn't have a rough upbringing like mine. She told me that grieving isn't just about mourning the loss of a person, but that you can grieve something you missed out on or an experience you never had. That was when I learned how to grieve the childhood I never had. Doing so helped me move past the PTSD and connect with people who had loving, stable families, a concept I'd always been deeply envious of. My therapist also pointed out that while I'm kind and empathetic to my loved ones, my inner dialogue is harsh and cruel. I would never speak to my friends the way I speak to myself, especially when they're struggling. Why was I bullying the person who needed my kindness the most? That realization made me aware of how I was treating myself, and although I still struggle with it at times, I'm doing much better now. Story 54. I realized that when my temper explodes, I'm actually having a panic attack. This was such an eye-opening moment that I ended up crying during the therapy session, which was the first time in 2 years I'd cried there. My therapist had always told me that anger is a form of fear, but I didn't fully understand it until she pointed out that anger can actually be a panic attack. That insight gave me the clarity I needed to work on fixing my temper. I was never violent or aggressive, but I could be incredibly cruel with my words, and then deeply regret what I'd said once I calmed down. Now that I recognize that scathing attitude is panic, I can address the fear in a more logical way rather than lashing out. Since then, my relationships with my parents, my sibling, and my spouse have improved significantly. Not only have I become better at managing myself, but I can now see their anger as fear too and respond to that, instead of just reacting to their temper. Story 55. You are only responsible for your own happiness, not anyone else's. It's not your job to worry about how others will react or feel. You need to take care of yourself and do what makes you happy. My therapist shared this with me when I was in the depths of a depression, feeling completely stuck in life. On paper, my life seemed perfect. I was graduating with a degree that would lead to a lucrative, respectable career, and I was in a relationship with a kind, genuine guy who was ready to propose. My friends and family were thrilled for me, thinking I had it all, the life they had always dreamed for me. But instead of feeling elated, I felt anxious and hopeless. I felt like I was drowning. I confided in my therapist, explaining my fear of how my family would react if I changed careers or ended my relationship. That's when she dropped this truth bomb, and it changed everything. That day, I stopped people-pleasing and started living for myself. I realized that for most of my life, I had been living for others, doing what I thought would make my parents proud or impress people. I didn't even know what I truly liked or what made me happy. A few months later, I came out to my family, and it felt like a massive weight was lifted. The physical tension in my body melted away, and I could finally breathe freely. Letting go of that secret I had carried for 2 decades was liberating. For the first time in my life, I felt at ease, even dancing naturally because every muscle in my body was relaxed. I began the process of getting to know myself and figuring out what truly made me happy. Now I work a mediocre job that gives me the work-life balance I had always wanted but never had. I'm happily married to a woman who brings me genuine joy, and I can be my authentic, goofy self with her, something I never imagined for myself. I'm surrounded by people who truly care about me and my happiness, not just the image I thought they had of me. No matter how perfect your life may look to others, make sure it's a life you want because, in the end, you're the one who has to live it. Story 56. I was venting about businesses violating state and federal laws regarding service dogs and trying to kick me out. My therapist said, "What are they going to do? If they try to remove you, that's assault." This really stuck with me and helped me apply it to a lot of other situations. For example, I went to pick up a product, they handed it to me, and then said I might need to sign something and asked me to wait. After waiting longer than a few minutes, I thought, what are they going to do if I just leave? I already had what I needed, so I left. Nothing happened. Another time, I went to a provider for a service, and the next day the technician texted me asking when I could travel to him because he forgot to have me sign paperwork. I didn't have the health to make that trip again, and I shouldn't have to or pay for transportation when I did everything right. Again, I thought, what are they going to do? I had already received the service. I considered offering to sign if he brought the paperwork to me at a convenient time, but I forgot, and he never reached out again. It really made me realize how much power we freely give away. Going behind the counter at a food service place? It's just something we all agree not to do. I've had someone do that when I was working food service, and the only power I had was telling them to get out. I didn't get paid enough to do anything beyond that, legal or moral considerations aside. Of course, some things matter, like parking in a handicapped spot, which could take a spot from someone who needs it, or issuing a chargeback that could lock your account or blacklist your card, or stealing, which could land you in jail. But outside of those things, we often give up more power than we realize. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.